Eleanor Fairbourne had worn the Ravenscroft sapphires once on her wedding night. When Nathaniel clasped them around her throat and whispered that she would always be his Duchess. Tonight, she watched those same jewels hang around another woman's neck while the entire ballroom held its breath waiting for her to weep. She did not weep. She pulled off her gloves, set them on the table like a woman laying down a life she was done carrying, and walked out without a single glance back. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this journey travels. The candles in the Ravenscroft ballroom burned the way they always did on the great occasion nights by the hundreds, dripping gold light across crystal and silk and the upturned faces of England's finest. The musicians played something lively from the far corner. Champagne moved from tray to glove to lip without interruption. Laughter bounced off marble floors. The room smelled of hothouse roses and expensive powder and the particular kind of satisfaction that only comes from knowing you belong somewhere. Eleanor Fairbourne stood near the eastern wall and felt none of it. She had attended 31 of these gatherings in 6 years of marriage. She had learned the names of every lord and lady in the room. She had memorized which families were feuding over land, which sons were gambling away inheritances, which daughters were quietly searching for a way out of bad betrothals. She had kept that knowledge to herself, the way she kept most things quietly. Carefully, without making a show of any of it, she held a glass of champagne she had not touched. Across the room, 40 feet and a lifetime away, her husband stood with his hand resting at the small of another woman's back. Lady Vivian Ashford. Eleanor had known the name for 8 months. She had known the shape of the situation longer than that, the way a woman always knows, in the soft animal part of her instincts, before she has a single piece of evidence to hold up to the light. She had told herself she was imagining it. She had told herself Nathaniel was simply attentive, the way powerful men were sometimes attentive to beautiful women at parties, without it meaning anything permanent. Tonight, she stopped telling herself that. Vivian Ashford was 29 years old, and built by God and society alike to stand exactly where she was standing in the center of a ballroom. In a gown the color of deep water, with her dark hair piled high and her chin lifted at an angle that she had never once questioned her right to take up space. She laughed at something Nathaniel said, and the laugh carried. Musical and deliberate, designed to be heard, Eleanor heard it. She also heard the whispers starting up around her. The women nearest the eastern wall had been pretending not to watch her for the last quarter of an hour. She could feel their attention moving between Nathaniel and herself like spectators at a sporting event, waiting to see which direction the thing would fall. She kept her face still. 6 years of marriage to a duke had taught her that. The face was the first thing they watched, and the first thing they used against you. Then Vivian moved. She stepped away from Nathaniel's side and crossed the ballroom floor with the slow, unhurried confidence of a woman who believed the room belonged to her. She was coming toward Eleanor. Eleanor understood this even before Vivian had covered half the distance. The entire arc of the evening had been building toward this moment. Vivian had been waiting for her audience to assemble. And now the audience was assembled, and here she came. Eleanor stood her ground. She did not step back. She did not look away. She simply watched Vivian Ashford walk toward her, and she let her own expression go as smooth and uninformative as still water. And she waited. Vivian stopped 3 feet away, and that was when Eleanor saw it. Around Vivian's throat, resting against her collarbone in a cascade of deep blue fire, sat the Ravenscroft sapphires. Eleanor had worn those stones exactly 4 times in 6 years. The first time was her wedding night. The second was the christening of a nephew. The third was a dinner at the palace that Nathaniel had insisted upon, where she'd spent 3 hours listening to ministers argue about grain taxes. The fourth time, she'd taken them off halfway through a state ball because the clasp was digging into her neck. And Nathaniel had looked at her like she'd committed a small but unforgivable social crime. He had told her, in the early days of their courtship, that those sapphires were passed from Duchess to Duchess, that they were not a gift, they were a declaration, that the woman who wore them in public was the woman he had chosen, fully and finally, before every eye that mattered. And now Vivian Ashford was wearing them. The room had gone quiet in that particular way that meant everyone had noticed, and no one was going to acknowledge it unless someone else moved first. Vivian smiled. It was a smile Eleanor recognized, the kind that belonged to women who had decided that cruelty was a sport and that the rules only applied to the losing side. Lady Ravenscroft, Vivian said. She used Eleanor's married title with a faint musical emphasis that made it sound like a consolation prize. What a lovely evening, isn't it? Eleanor looked at the sapphires. She looked at Vivian's face. She looked at the smile. It is, she said. Vivian's smile widened. She touched the sapphires with 2 fingers. Lightly, the way a woman touches something she has already decided she owns. His Grace has been so generous, Vivian said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear every syllable. He told me he'd been holding these for someone who could truly appreciate them. She paused. And then added, with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror, he said they were wasted on someone who doesn't understand society. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor heard a woman somewhere to her left draw a sharp breath. She heard the musicians, still playing distantly, in a world that seemed suddenly very far from this one. She heard the blood moving in her own ears, steady and deliberate. The way it moved in moments when the body understood something, before the mind had finished catching up. She looked across the ballroom at Nathaniel. He was watching her. He stood with 2 other men she recognized, Lord Pemberton and that young Viscount from Shropshire, whose names she always forgot, and he was watching her over their heads with an expression she could not quite read. Not guilt, not quite. Something more complicated than guilt, and less dignified. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who had wanted something to happen, and was now watching it happen, and was not entirely prepared for how it felt. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she did something that nobody in that ballroom expected. She did not cry, she did not raise her voice, she did not reach out and take the sapphires back by force, though the thought did cross her mind with a satisfying clarity. She looked at Vivian Ashford and she smiled. It was a real smile. Small and contained and entirely genuine, the way a smile is when it comes from something solid rather than something performed. "Those stones do suit you," Eleanor said, in a voice pitched low enough that only Vivian and the nearest few guests could hear her. "But I wonder if His Grace has told you the whole story of those sapphires." Vivian's smile flickered. "What story?" "They've been in the Ravenscroft family for 140 years, Eleanor said. Every woman who has worn them in public has done so as the declared Duchess. That's what they mean. Not generosity," she held Vivian's gaze. "A declaration." Something moved through Vivian's expression. Not fear exactly, but the first small shadow of it. "I'm sure His Grace," Eleanor said quietly, "will need to explain himself to rather a lot of people come morning." She set her champagne glass on the table beside her with a soft, definitive click. She pulled off her white gloves, one and then the other, and set them on the table beside the glass. "I hope you enjoy the evening, Lady Ashford." Then she turned and walked toward the doors. She walked the way she had always walked, straight-backed, unhurried, with the particular bearing that her mother had drilled into her, before Eleanor was old enough to understand why dignity mattered. She did not look at Nathaniel as she passed him. She felt his attention on her like a pressure at her back. And she did not turn. The footman at the great doors opened them without being asked. Cold Yorkshire air hit her face like water. She went down the stone steps and into the dark, and she did not stop walking. The carriage took her east, along the old road that ran through the valley between the Ravenscroft lands and the Fairbourne ones. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the dark hedgerows move past the window and did not think about the sapphires or Vivian's face or the way the room had gone quiet. She thought instead about the estate she was going home to. Fairbourne Hall had been empty for 3 years. She had kept the groundskeeper on and paid the household taxes out of her own account, the account Nathaniel did not know about. The one that came from her grandmother's trust. The one that had been set up in language so specific and so old that not even a duke's solicitors could touch it. She had kept the house shuttered and aired it twice a year and told herself she was simply being a responsible heir. Now she understood she had been keeping it ready. The carriage turned through the Fairbourne gates just before midnight. The old stone pillars caught the moonlight. The house sat dark and quiet at the end of the gravel drive. Its chimneys cold, its windows shuttered, its gardens gone, a little wild at the edges. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the footman's hand. She stood on the gravel and looked up at the house for a long moment. "Light the fire," she told the driver, "and send word to Mrs. Hadley in the village. I'll need the house opened by morning." Then she went inside. She did not sleep. She lit a candle from the kitchen coals and carried it through the dark rooms, pulling back dust sheets, opening windows a crack to let the stale air move. The furniture underneath the sheets was the same furniture she had grown up with, her mother's writing desk, the long dining table her grandfather had brought back from Italy, the bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling in the library and still held every book she had read as a girl. She ran her hand along the spines. She sat at her mother's desk and opened the center drawer. Inside, exactly where she had left it 3 years ago, was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting. She did not need to read it. She had read it enough times that she could have recited it in her sleep, but she unfolded it and smoothed it flat on the desk and let herself look at it anyway. Eleanor, her grandmother, had written, "You carry the Fairbourne name whether or not you choose to use it. A name is not a decoration. It is an argument. When the time comes to make that argument, make it clearly and without apology." She folded the letter back into quarters and set it in the drawer. Then she opened the account ledger she had carried in her traveling case, the one she kept in a locked box beneath her bed at Ravenscroft, and the one that Nathaniel had never asked about and she had never offered, and she began to work. By the time the sun came up and Mrs. Hadley arrived with 2 of her daughters and enough provisions to open the house properly, Eleanor had been awake for 20 hours and had filled 14 pages of the ledger with notes. She had been keeping mental track of the Ravenscroft estate finances for 6 years. Not because Nathaniel had asked her to, he hadn't. He had a steward for that, a man named Garvey, who presented quarterly reports that Nathaniel signed without reading. But Eleanor had grown up in a household where her mother reviewed every account personally, and she had never been able to stop herself from noticing things. The numbers, when she added them up now, were not good. Garvey had been systematically overstating expenses and pocketing the difference for at least 4 years. Eleanor estimated the total at somewhere between £8,000 and £12,000. Though the true figure would require access to the original receipts, which she did not currently have. The 8 tenant farmers, 32 families, had been charged rents that exceeded their agreements by anywhere from 10 to 30%, with the excess going into Garvey's private accounts rather than the estate coffers. 2 of the farms had fallen into serious arrears as a result, and she was fairly certain Nathaniel had no idea any of this was happening. She also knew that Nathaniel had been borrowing against the estate's future income to fund his London lifestyle, the clubs, the horses, the entertainments that kept him current in society's eyes. The borrowing was not illegal, but it was reckless. And the terms were worse than she suspected he realized. And then there was the matter of the northern parcel. 1,500 acres of Ravenscroft land in the northern corner of the estate had been quietly reassigned, not sold. Exactly, but assigned to a holding company whose ownership, when she traced it through 3 layers of paperwork, terminated at a name she recognized, a name connected to Garvey by marriage. She set her pen down and pressed her fingers against her temples. "Mrs. Hadley," she called. The older woman appeared in the doorway immediately, which suggested she had been hovering, which was entirely in character. "Yes, ma'am. I need to send 2 letters this morning. One to London, one to a solicitor in York, a Mr. Aldrich. If he's still practicing. His son is practicing too. Now, sharp as the father, they say. Good. I'll need paper and ink and the use of a fast writer. I'll see to it directly, Mrs." Hadley paused. Then, with the careful casualness of a woman who wants to ask something, and has decided to ask it sidelong rather than straight on, she said, "Are you home for a while then, my lady?" Eleanor looked up from the ledger. "I'm home," she said. "Yes." Mrs. Hadley nodded. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but recognition, the way a face changes when it sees something it has been waiting for. "Right," she said. "I'll put the kettle on as well." The letter to London was addressed to Lord Edmund Valehart. Edmund was 58 years old, had been her father's closest friend, and had known Eleanor since she was 4 years old, and had bitten a footman who tried to take her book away at dinner. He was one of the 3 men in England she trusted without qualification, and the only one currently within a reasonable journey of Yorkshire. She wrote him the facts, not the emotions. Edmund had no particular use for emotions, which was one of the things she had always respected about him, but the facts. Laid out in her clearest hand, the sapphires, Garvey's accounts, the northern parcel, her current location. She ended the letter with a single line. "I am not asking to be rescued. I am asking for your eyes on the paperwork." The second letter was to Aldrich the solicitor, and it was a great deal longer. And when she finished writing it, her hand ached, and the candle had burned down 2 inches. She sealed both letters and handed them to Mrs. Hadley's eldest daughter, who had her mother's practical air and her father's fast horse, and watched from the window as the girl rotoed out through the Fairbourne gates. Then she went upstairs, lay down on the bed she had slept in as a girl, and was asleep before she had finished the thought she was trying to have. She dreamed about her mother. Not a dramatic dream, nothing with weeping or reproach or the particular theater that dreams sometimes produced in difficult times. Just her mother at the kitchen table of this same house, reviewing accounts the way she did every Friday morning, with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow and a pen in her hand, and the particular concentrated quiet of a woman working on something that mattered. In the dream, Eleanor sat across from her and watched. Her mother looked up, eventually, and said, "You know what you're doing." It wasn't a question. Eleanor woke up to afternoon light coming through the gap in the shutters and the sound of Mrs. Hadley's daughters moving furniture somewhere below. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. She did know what she was doing. She had known at some level, since she set her gloves on that table and walked away from a ballroom full of people who expected her to fall apart. She had not fallen apart. She had calculated. She was the last Fairbourne heir. That name carried weight in England that Nathaniel had never bothered to understand, because he had never thought it necessary to understand something he didn't consider a threat. The Fairbourne family had held land in Yorkshire and influence in Parliament since before the Ravenscrofts were anything more than a moderately successful merchant family with aristocratic ambitions. Her grandfather had served 3 kings. Her grandmother had corresponded personally with half the peerage. The Fairbourne name, invoked correctly and in the right rooms, opened doors that a mere duke's title could not. Nathaniel had married her thinking her family name was a pleasant addition to his own credentials. He had not understood that he was inviting something much older and much more serious than he had reckoned with into his household. She sat up and reached for the ledger on the bedside table and began making a list. Edmund Valehart arrived 4 days later, which was faster than she had expected and entirely characteristic of him. He came in a plain traveling carriage with two men she didn't recognize and a leather satchel that looked like it contained the complete working records of several of England's more prominent legal firms. He came through the front door without ceremony, handed his hat to Mrs. Hadley, looked at Eleanor for a long moment with the assessing gaze he'd been aiming at her since she was a child, and said, "You look thin." "I've been working," she said. "Show me." She showed him. They spent 2 days going through everything: her ledger notes, the copies of documents she had quietly made over 6 years, because she had always had the sense that precision would matter eventually. The correspondence from Aldrich the solicitor, who had confirmed several of her suspicions through the county land records, and was currently pursuing 3 others. Edmund sat across the desk from her, spectacles on, pen moving steadily, and said almost nothing for hours at a stretch. Occasionally, he made a sound in the back of his throat that she had learned, over decades of knowing him, to interpret as either profound disapproval or grudging respect, and she had not yet determined which one was which in any given instance. On the evening of the second day, he set his pen down and took his spectacles off, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Garvey," he said, "you're certain? The arithmetic doesn't lie," she said. "No." He looked at the papers spread across the desk. "What do you intend to do with all of this? Present it?" He raised an eyebrow. "To whom?" "To everyone who needs to see it," she said. "The county magistrate has jurisdiction over the land reassignment. Aldrich is preparing a petition on behalf of the tenant families. The borrowing agreements can be renegotiated if they're approached correctly, which I believe they can be." She folded her hands on the desk. "And the sapphires are Fairbourne family stones. They were passed to the Ravenscroft family upon my grandmother's death specifically, and the deed of transfer contains language that ties them to the active Duchess, not to whoever the Duke has most recently decided to favor." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. "You've been working on this for quite some time," he said. It was not quite an accusation, but it had that particular weight. "I've been noticing things for quite some time," she said. "There's a difference." He put his spectacles back on. "And Nathaniel?" She was quiet for a moment. "He'll hear it all when the time is right," she said. "Not before. He has spent 6 years deciding what I was worth based on what he thought he understood about me. I intend to let him finish that process before I correct his understanding." Edmund made the sound in the back of his throat that she was now fairly certain was respect. "Your grandmother," he said, "would have done exactly this." "I know," Eleanor said. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The gossip from the Ravenscroft ball had been spreading through Yorkshire and toward London with the particular velocity that society gossip achieved when everyone involved was interesting enough to talk about. Eleanor heard versions of it secondhand through Mrs. Hadley, who heard it from the butcher, who heard it from the blacksmith, who heard it from a groom who worked at one of the neighboring estates. The version that seemed to be winning had Eleanor either weeping into her pillow at Fairbourne Hall or plotting some unspecified but magnificent form of revenge. Neither was accurate, though the second was closer. Nathaniel had sent 2 letters. She had read them both and set them aside unanswered. The first was formal to the point of coldness, a summoning, more than an apology, requesting her return to Ravenscroft Manor to avoid further social embarrassment. The second was less formal and more uncomfortable to read, because it contained something that might have been genuine remorse if it hadn't been so tangled up with self-interest. She did not hate him for the letters. She did not hate him at all, which she had been mildly surprised to discover. What she felt was something quieter and more final than hatred, a clear-eyed understanding of who he was and what he valued and what she was worth to him, which was apparently less than social standing and a great deal less than he had ever bothered to make her believe. She had spent 6 years being useful to a man who was not paying attention. She was not interested in spending 6 more. On the 12th day after the ball, Aldrich arrived in person with a stack of documents that required her signature and a young clerk who took notes with ferocious speed and almost no wasted motion. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time the clerk packed his case and the solicitor had departed back toward York, Eleanor had set 3 legal processes in motion, none of which could be undone without her consent. She walked Edmund to his carriage that evening, in the cool air under a sky that had gone the deep blue of late autumn dusk. "There's a gathering next month," he said, settling his hat. "In London, the Harwick Salon. Every family of consequence will attend." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Your grandmother," he said, "made rather a famous entrance at that same salon. In 1784. I was 16 and I remember it clearly." He paused. "The Fairbourne crest is quite striking when it's properly displayed." "It is," she said. He studied her face for a moment. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked. Eleanor thought about the ballroom, about the sapphires, about Vivian's smile and Nathaniel's face and the sound of champagne glasses and a roomful of people waiting to see her fall apart. She thought about her grandmother's letter in the desk drawer. "Make the argument clearly and without apology, yes?" she said. Edmund nodded once, the way he nodded when he considered a matter settled, and got into his carriage, and the carriage rolled out through the Fairbourne gates. Eleanor stood on the gravel drive and watched it go. Somewhere in London, a ballroom season was rolling on without her. Nathaniel was navigating the social consequences of what he had done, and Vivian Ashford was calculating her next move. And the people who had watched Eleanor set down her gloves and walk away were deciding what kind of story they were going to tell about her. Let them tell it, she thought. The real story had not started yet. She turned and went back inside, and the door of Fairbourne Hall closed behind her. Solid and final, like a woman who had made up her mind. The first thing Eleanor did on the morning of the 13th day was fire Garvey. She did not do it by letter. She did not send Edmund or Aldrich or anyone else in her place. She put on her riding clothes, saddled her own horse, because the Fairbourne stable boy was 12 years old and she didn't want him anywhere near what was about to happen. And she rode the 4 miles between Fairbourne Hall and Ravenscroft Manor at a pace that left her arriving with color in her cheeks and a particular set to her jaw that Mrs. Hadley, had she seen it, would have recognized immediately. Garvey was in the estate office when she arrived. He was a broad man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something harder and more calculated. He had always treated Eleanor with a particular brand of courtesy that contained, just beneath its surface, the clear implication that he was doing her a favor by bothering. He looked up from his desk when she came through the door, and his expression moved through several stages in quick succession: surprise, reassessment, and then the particular confident recovery of a man who has spent years getting away with things. "Lady Ravenscroft," he said, "this is unexpected." "I know where His Grace is," Eleanor said. "I'm not here for His Grace." She set a folder of papers on the desk in front of him. He looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" "The last 4 years of your accounting," she said. Cross-referenced with the receipts from the York suppliers, the tenant rent agreements, and the land transfer records from the county office. She pulled the chair from the side of the desk and sat in it without being invited. "I've also included a detailed account of the Northern Parcel reassignment, including the documentation connecting the holding company to your brother-in-law's firm." The color left Garvey's face with a speed that was almost impressive. "I don't know what you think I think I've found approximately 11,000. £400, Eleanor said, "give or take. Aldrich believes the final figure will be closer to 12. We'll know more precisely once the York suppliers respond to his inquiry." Garvey's jaw tightened. "His Grace will hear about this intrusion." "His Grace," Eleanor said, "will hear about all of it." including the part where you've been charging the Marsh family £3 over their lease agreement every quarter for 4 years. Which is why Thomas Marsh's youngest daughter has been taking in laundry to cover the difference. She watched his face. Did you know that? That the Marsh girl is 14 years old and taking in laundry? Something moved behind Garvey's eyes that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. That is not. You have until Friday, Eleanor said. She stood. To collect your personal effects and arrange your departure. I have already spoken to a Mr. Henley in the village, who has agreed to serve as interim steward while a proper replacement is found. He will begin on Monday. Garvey stood too, and he was considerably larger standing than sitting. And he leaned forward across the desk with an expression that had dropped all pretense of courtesy. You have no authority here, he said. This is Ravenscroft land. You are the Ravenscroft Duchess. I am an heir of the Fairbourne estate, Eleanor said. In a voice so quiet it required him to lean forward slightly to hear it. With a legal interest in a fraudulent land transfer involving Ravenscroft holdings. A complaint filed with the county magistrate, and documentation sufficient to pursue criminal charges. She picked up the folder. You are a man who has been stealing from a family for 4 years. I would choose your next words carefully. Garvey said nothing. She walked out. The groom who had been holding her horse in the courtyard had clearly been attempting to appear very busy examining a bridle. He handed over the reins without meeting her eyes. And she was back on the road before the shaking in her hands had fully resolved. Because her hands were shaking, she was honest enough with herself to notice that. Not from fear. She had not been afraid of Garvey, not exactly. She had been afraid of something quieter and harder to name, the possibility that she would get into that room and find her voice gone. Find herself retreating into the 6 years of careful silence she had built around herself at Ravenscroft Manor. The possibility that she had spent so long making herself small that she had forgotten how to take up space. But she hadn't forgotten. She rode back toward Fairbourne Hall, and she let the morning air do what morning air did. And by the time the gates came into view, the shaking had stopped. She had work to do. Nathaniel arrived at Fairbourne Hall 3 days later without sending word ahead. Eleanor was in the library when Mrs. Hadley appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman managing several conflicting impulses simultaneously. His Grace, my lady. Eleanor set her pen down. Show him in. He looked tired. That was the first thing she noticed, the kind of tired that had less to do with sleep than with 3 weeks of carrying something heavy. He was dressed well, because Nathaniel was always dressed well. But there was a quality to his bearing that she had not seen before. Something reduced. He came into the library and stopped when he saw the desk covered in papers. He looked at the papers, and then at her, and then at the papers again, with an expression that she couldn't quite interpret. Eleanor, he said, Nathaniel. He took a breath. He stopped. Started again. I owe you an explanation. You owe me a great deal more than that, she said. Pleasantly. But an explanation is a reasonable place to start. He looked at her for a moment, with something flickering at the back of his eyes that she might, 6 months ago, have read as affection. Now she simply waited. Vivian and I, he said, and then stopped, as if the sentence had more weight in his mouth than he'd expected. It began last year. I want you to know that I never intended, Nathaniel. Her voice was gentle, but her meaning wasn't. I am not interested in what you intended. Intention is what people claim when they want the credit for having meant well, without the consequence of having done badly. He was quiet. Did you know, she said, that Garvey has been stealing for this estate for 4 years? Nathaniel blinked. The shift in subject visibly caught him off balance. What? £11,000 approximately. Possibly 12. The county magistrate has the initial filing. Aldrich is completing the formal complaint this week. She watched him. You signed quarterly reports for 4 years without reading them. I trusted. You trusted a man you had never investigated, she said. Because you were busy with other things. She set her hands on the desk. Very still. The Marsh girl is 14 years old. Thomas Marsh's youngest daughter. She's been taking in laundry for 2 years to cover rent that Garvey was overcharging by 30%. Did you know that? No, Nathaniel said. His voice had gone quiet. I didn't know that. I know you didn't, she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. That is rather the problem. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her desk without being asked. For a moment, he simply looked at his hands. You've been watching all of this, he said. The accounts? The estate? All of it. For 6 years. And you never said anything. She considered that. I said several things, she said. You were not in the habit of listening. He didn't argue with that. She had expected him to argue with that, had prepared for it. And his not arguing was somehow more difficult to navigate than the argument would have been. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to finish what I've started, she said. Garvey will face the magistrate. The tenant agreements will be corrected. The northern parcel will be returned to proper estate management. The borrowing agreements need to be renegotiated. I have a contact in London who can arrange better terms if the approach is handled correctly. She paused. The estate can recover. It will take 2 years, possibly 3. But it can recover. Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that had the quality of a man seeing a room he had walked past 1,000 times and suddenly understanding that he had never actually looked inside it. Why, he said. She frowned slightly. Why what? Why do any of this? For Ravenscroft. He stopped. You have no obligation. You could walk away entirely. She was quiet for a moment. The tenant families have obligations to this land, she said finally. The workers have obligations. Thomas Marsh's daughter has been taking in laundry. She met his eyes. I don't do this for you, Nathaniel. I do it because it's right. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I gave Vivian those sapphires. I know, she gave them back. He said it without drama, which made it land harder. After she understood, after the solicitors clarified the Fairbourne deed language, she came to me and gave them back without a word. A pause. She wasn't interested once she understood the full picture. Eleanor said nothing. I wanted you to know that, he said. Thank you for telling me. She picked up her pen. I have work to finish before supper, Nathaniel. Mrs. Hadley will arrange a room if you need to stay the night. He stood. He looked at her for a moment, longer than was comfortable for either of them. I didn't know what you were, he said. It was not an excuse. It came out sounding more like something a man says when he has arrived. Too late at a simple truth. You didn't. He left. She put her pen to the paper and held it there for a moment without writing anything. Then she took a breath and began. Word traveled the way it always traveled in county society sideways. Through conversation and inference and the particular social machinery that processed other people's business with such enthusiastic efficiency. Eleanor heard that Garvey had retained a solicitor of his own. She heard that Nathaniel had returned to London, looking considerably less assured than he'd left. She heard, through Edmund, and through 3 separate letters that arrived within the same week, that the story of the Fairbourne, ere the quiet Duchess, who had walked away from the Ravenscroft ballroom and come home to a different life, was moving through London drawing rooms with a speed that suggested people found it considerably more interesting than they'd expected. She did not find any of this particularly surprising. What she had not expected was the visitors. They started arriving in the 3rd week. Not Nathaniel, and not anyone connected to him directly, but women. Mostly from the surrounding county estates. Some she knew well. Some she barely recognized. They came with calling cards and, with varying degrees of stated purpose, a desire to discuss the charity school she had mentioned to Mrs. Hadley, an interest in the estate's revised tenant arrangements. A wish to simply pay their respects. The first was Lady Heron from the neighboring estate. A woman in her 60s who had known Eleanor's mother, and who arrived with a directness that Eleanor found immediately restful. I heard what you did to Garvey. Lady Heron said, sitting across the desk in the library with a cup of tea in her hand and no preamble whatsoever. The magistrate is an old friend of my husband's. The whole county knows by now. I suspect they do, Eleanor said. Margaret Marsh came to see me yesterday, Lady Heron said. Thomas Marsh's wife. She cried for 10 minutes straight and then apologized for crying. A pause. She said her daughter can stop taking in laundry. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. You've created a certain amount of disruption, Lady Heron said. But not disapprovingly. I've corrected certain things that required correcting. Lady Heron studied her over the rim of her teacup. Your mother was the same way, she said. Never loud. Never dramatic. Just inevitable. She set the cup down. What's this about a school? Eleanor had mentioned the school almost in passing, a comment to Mrs. Hadley about the lack of any proper instruction available for the village children, who were mostly receiving haphazard lessons from the local curate when he had time, which was rarely. She had not made any firm plans. She had simply said out loud that it seemed like something that should exist. Apparently that was enough. By the time Lady Heron left Fairbourne Hall that afternoon, they had outlined the bones of it together, a building. Likely the old Fairbourne granary, which had been empty for 2 years and was structurally sound. A teacher to be recruited from York, materials to be funded from Eleanor's trust account. A preliminary enrollment of somewhere between 15 and 20 children from the Marsh, Henley, Cooper, and Briggs families. You'll need a committee, Lady Heron said. At the door, I'll need a teacher first, Eleanor said. I know one. I'll write tomorrow. After she left, Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment and thought about how quickly things moved when you stopped waiting for permission. The second letter from Nathaniel arrived 10 days later. It was longer than the first two combined. He had read, or had read to him, the full account of Garvey's actions. He had met with the county magistrate himself. He had personally visited Thomas Marsh and his family. This he mentioned in a single sentence, without embellishment, which told her more than a paragraph of explanation would have. He wrote about the estate, about the accounts, about conversations he had been having with the staff, conversations he wrote that he should have been having for years. He wrote about the borrowing and the terms, and a meeting he had arranged with Edmund's contact in London, which Eleanor had not suggested to him, but which he had apparently organized on his own initiative. At the end of the letter, he wrote a paragraph that she read 3 times. I have been asking myself these past weeks what I believed marriage to be. I think the honest answer is that I believed it to be a social arrangement that required management, not attention. I believed that competence in an estate, in a household, in a person was satisfactory. That satisfaction was the same as value. A long blank line. I understand now that I was mistaken. I understand now that I confused your silence with contentment, and your patience with absence. I do not write this expecting forgiveness. I write it because it is true, and because you have always, as far as I can determine, been owed the truth. She folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer with her grandmother's. She did not write back. Not yet. She was not ready to write back. And she was done doing things before she was ready. The London gathering that Edmund had mentioned was 6 weeks away when the third major development arrived. And it arrived in the form of a young woman Eleanor had never met, who came to Fairbourne Hall on a Tuesday morning without a calling card and asked through Mrs. Hadley whether Lady Fairbourne might be willing to speak with her. Eleanor came down to the sitting room and found a girl of perhaps 22, plainly dressed, with the careful posture of someone who had practiced appearing unafraid. Lady Fairbourne, the girl said. My name is Clara Jennings. I was employed at Ravenscroft Manor until last month. Eleanor sat down. Sit down, Miss Jennings. The girl sat. What brought you here? Clara Jennings looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. I worked in the house accounts office, she said. Under Mr. Garvey. I was hired 2 years ago as a records clerk. I saw things that I didn't understand at first. And then when I began to understand them, I was afraid to say anything. Because Mr. Garvey made it very clear that the position of anyone who caused difficulty for him would become uncertain. Eleanor waited. I kept copies, Clara said. She opened the small bag she'd been holding in her lap and produced a folded envelope. I know it wasn't my place. I know I should have done something sooner. But I kept copies, because I thought someone would want to know the truth. Eleanor took the envelope. She opened it. Inside were 12 receipts and 2 letters. The receipts were originals, the actual supplier's receipts. The ones that showed what the estate had genuinely paid, as opposed to the inflated figures in Garvey's ledgers. The 2 letters were between Garvey and his brother-in-law, discussing the northern parcel transfer in language that left very little room for interpretation. Eleanor looked up from the papers. "Miss Jennings," she said. "How long have you been carrying these?" 14 months, the girl said. Eleanor thought about that, about a young woman in a records office, copying documents in secret, holding on to them for 14 months, not knowing who to give them to, or whether anyone would listen. "You are going to need to speak to Aldrich," Eleanor said. "My solicitor in York." This, she held up the letters, changes the nature of the complaint significantly. Will there be consequences for me for having taken them?" Eleanor looked at her steadily. "You kept evidence of fraud committed against 32 tenant families and an estate you were employed to serve," she said. "No, there will not be consequences for you." A pause. "There will, however, be consequences for Garvey. These letters are precisely what we needed." Clara Jennings let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 14 months. "I'll speak to whoever you need," she said. "I'll say whatever needs to be said." "You won't need to say anything except the truth," Eleanor said. "The truth in this case is entirely sufficient." She called Mrs. Hadley and asked her to make up a room. Clara Jennings stayed 3 days, gave her testimony to Aldrich in a 4-hour meeting at the kitchen table that left the solicitor's clerk with a hand cramp and a stack of notes 2 inches thick, and departed with a letter of character reference from Eleanor that detailed, in precise and warm language, exactly the kind of courage it took to do what Clara had done. Edmund, when Eleanor wrote him about the letters, replied with a single line, "The magistrate will want a formal hearing. This is no longer a civil matter." She wrote back, "I know. Arrange it." The formal hearing was set for 3 weeks before the London gathering. Eleanor attended in person, which caused something of a stir, because women of her station did not typically appear at magistrate proceedings unless they were there as witnesses. And even then, they were not generally the ones who had organized the entire complaint. She sat at the back of the room and watched Aldrich present the case with the methodical precision that had made him one of York's most respected solicitors. And she watched Garvey's face as document after document was introduced. And she felt nothing particular toward him, not satisfaction, not anger, not the complex mixture of vindication and sadness she had half expected. What she felt was something much simpler: clarity. Lady Heron sat beside her. She had insisted, when Eleanor mentioned the hearing, that she would attend as well, and Eleanor had not argued. "How are you?" Lady Heron murmured at one point, during a pause in the proceedings. "I'm well," Eleanor said. "You don't look angry." "I'm not angry." Lady Heron studied her profile. "No," she said after a moment. "You're not, are you? It wasn't a question. You look like a woman who has finished something." Eleanor looked at Aldrich, at the papers spread before the magistrate, at the carefully documented accounting of years of quiet theft from people who couldn't afford to lose what had been taken from them. "Not finished," she said. "Not yet. Garvey was remanded for formal trial. The northern parcel reassignment was suspended pending investigation. The magistrate issued an immediate order correcting the tenant rent arrangements and establishing a process for restitution. Eleanor walked out of the magistrate's office into the cool York afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed. Lady Heron came out behind her and stood beside her without saying anything, which was precisely the right thing to do. After a minute, Eleanor said, "The teacher you found for the school, Miss Parrish. She's agreed she can start in January." "Good." Eleanor turned up the collar of her coat. "We'll need to have the granary ready before then. I was thinking we could ask the Marsh boys to help with the repairs. Thomas Marsh's eldest is 20 and handy with timber." "He is," Lady Heron agreed. "I'll mention it." They walked toward the carriage together, and Eleanor thought about a school full of village children learning to read, and about a 14-year-old girl who had stopped taking in laundry, and about Clara Jennings carrying an envelope for 14 months because she believed that someday someone would want to know the truth. She thought about all the things that had happened in the 6 weeks since she had set her gloves down on a table in a ballroom and walked away from a life that had not been built for her. She thought about the London gathering, Edmund's words from that evening at the gate. "The Fairbourne crest is quite striking when it's properly displayed." She thought about what it meant to walk into a room not as someone's wife, not as a footnote to a more powerful name, but as Eleanor Fairbourne, the last heir of one of England's oldest families. The woman who had rebuilt a school and corrected a fraud and given a young records clerk her voice back and was not by any measure finished yet. She got into the carriage. "Edmund thinks we should attend the Harwick gathering," she said. Lady Heron raised an eyebrow. "And you?" Eleanor looked out the window at the York streets, at the people moving past with their ordinary errands and their ordinary lives. And she thought about a ballroom full of people waiting for her to weep, and what happened when a woman refused to perform the collapse everyone expected. "I think," she said slowly, "that it is time to stop being quiet." Lady Heron smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged to a woman who had been waiting for someone to say exactly that. "Well," she said, "then we'll need a proper gown." The gown arrived from London 4 days before the Harwick gathering. Lady Heron had arranged it through a modiste she trusted, a woman named Madame Colette, who had dressed half the peerage for 30 years and understood, without being told explicitly, that this particular commission required something beyond fashionable. It required something definitive. Eleanor opened the box in the Fairbourne library with Mrs. Hadley and Lady Heron both present, because Lady Heron had appointed herself chief advisor on the matter and Mrs. Hadley had appointed herself chief advisor on Lady Heron, and Eleanor had decided that fighting either of them on it would cost more energy than it was worth. The gown was deep gold, not yellow, not amp, but the specific dark gold of old coin, the color that the Fairbourne family had worn at formal occasions for 140 years. Along the hem and at the cuffs, embroidered in silk thread so fine it was nearly invisible until the light caught it, ran the Fairbourne crest, understated, precise, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Eleanor held it up and said nothing for a moment. "Well," Lady Heron said. "It's exactly right," Eleanor said. Mrs. Hadley made a sound that was not quite a sob and excused herself to see about supper. They traveled to London in Edmund's carriage, which was larger and better appointed than Eleanor's, and which Edmund had insisted upon with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that the logistics of a situation are the one area where he retains authority. Eleanor did not argue. She spent the journey reading correspondence, 3 letters from Aldrich about the Garvey hearing, 1 from the York School Board confirming Miss Parrish's appointment, 1 from Thomas Marsh that was only 4 lines long and required her to set it face down on the seat for several minutes before she could finish it without her eyes stinging. Edmund watched her from across the carriage and said nothing until they were 2 hours outside London. "Are you prepared for the possibility that this does not go as planned?" he asked. Eleanor looked up from the Aldrich letter. "What aspect of it?" "Any of it." "All of it." He settled his hands on his coat. "London society is not Yorkshire." The people in that room tomorrow night have spent decades perfecting the art of watching someone be destroyed while maintaining the expression of mild, pleasant interest. They will not applaud you, Eleanor. They will simply recalibrate. I'm not looking for applause, she said. What are you looking for? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. I want them to see me clearly, she said. For the first time, I want to walk into a room and have the people in it see exactly who I am. Not Nathaniel's wife. Not a quiet country duchess they have no reason to pay attention to. She looked back at the letter. Just Eleanor Fairbourne, and let them decide what to make of that. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother said something similar, he said. In 1784, before the Harwick gathering, where she wore the Fairbourne colors for the first time after your grandfather's death. He paused. She walked into that room and every head turned, and she told me afterward that it felt like finally speaking in her own voice after years of translating herself for other people. Eleanor looked at him. You never told me that story before. You didn't need it before, he said simply, and went back to looking out the window. The Harwick salon occupied the entirety of Lord and Lady Harwick's London townhouse, which was large enough to swallow most of Yorkshire's social calendar whole. By the time Eleanor arrived with Edmund and Lady Heron, the rooms were already full, the kind of full that had a particular sound. A layered roar of conversation and music and crystal, and the elaborate social machinery of 100 families, all performing their status for one another simultaneously. A footman opened the main doors. Edmund offered Eleanor his arm. She took it, and they went in. The reaction was not immediate. It moved through the room the way a wave moves, starting at the edges and traveling inward. A gradual shift in attention that began with the nearest cluster of guests and spread, person by person, outward through the crowd. Eleanor felt it without looking for it. She had attended enough of these gatherings to know how the air changed when something unexpected entered it. She kept her chin level. She kept her pace unhurried. She let the room look, and the room looked. Old Lord Pemberton, who had been standing near Nathaniel the night of the Ravenscroft ball, and had therefore witnessed, from close range, the beginning of all of this, was the first person to approach her directly. He was 70 years old, and had known her grandmother, and he came toward her with the particular purposeful energy of a man who has something to say and intends to say it before anyone else gets the chance. Lady Fairbourne, he said. He used the name deliberately, and she heard the choice in it, not Lady Ravenscroft. Not the Duchess, but the name she'd been born to. You are a sight, Lord Pemberton, she said warmly. You look well. I look old, he said, and so does this room. Frankly, compared to you. He glanced at the crest on her cuff. Just briefly, and something in his eyes settled with recognition. Your grandmother wore that crest to this exact room in 1784. Did you know that? Edmund told me, she said. On the carriage ride. Pemberton made a sound like a laugh that had been through considerable refinement. She was magnificent, he said, so are you. He offered a short bow, which in a man of his generation was a statement, and then moved away. And Eleanor did not miss the fact that 3 separate conversations nearby had paused to watch the exchange. She had been in the room for 12 minutes when she saw Nathaniel. He was across the salon, near the windows, talking to 2 men she recognized as members of the Lords. He had not seen her yet. She could tell by the easy quality of his posture he was still carrying himself the way he carried himself at these events when he felt on solid ground, which told her that he had not yet understood what the evening was about to contain. She did not go toward him. She let the room do its work. And it did. The first whisper reached Nathaniel within minutes. She could track it by watching the faces nearest him. The small shifts of attention, the way one of the men he was speaking to glanced across the room with an expression of reassessment and then looked back at Nathaniel with something that might have been pity. Nathaniel followed the glance. He found her across the room. And Eleanor watched his face change. It changed the way a face changes when something you have filed away as a manageable problem reveals itself to be something else entirely. The confidence did not disappear. Nathaniel was too trained for that, but it shifted, reconfigured, became something more careful and considerably less certain. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to Lady Heron, who was introducing her to a woman from the Bath social circuit, and gave the introduction her full and genuine attention. It was Lady Cecily Broughton who broke first. Lady Cecily was one of the women who had been standing near Eleanor at the Ravenscroft ball. She had been part of the particular cluster that had watched Vivienne deliver her performance with the sapphires and had then watched Eleanor walk away. And she had been, in Eleanor's assessment, the most actively interested of the observers, the one whose attention had the quality of someone filing information away for later use. She found Eleanor near the refreshment table, 20 minutes into the evening, with the particular gliding approach of a woman who wants to appear to have arrived somewhere accidentally. "Lady Fairbourne," she said. "Or forgive me, should I still say Lady Ravenscroft? I confess the situation is nuanced." "Lady Fairbourne is perfectly correct," Eleanor said pleasantly. Cecily's smile had the brittle precision of expensive porcelain. "Of course." A pause. "You look remarkable. Is that the Fairbourne crest?" "I don't believe I've seen it worn in decades. My grandmother wore it last." "I believe," Eleanor said, "in 1784, at this salon." As it happens. Cecily blinked. A flicker of something moved through her expression. "How extraordinary," she said. "And forgive me for asking, are you in London for long?" "For as long as is needed," Eleanor said. Another pause. "I heard," Cecily said, lowering her voice by approximately 1 calculated degree. "About the Ravenscroft estate steward. The hearing. It's been quite the talk." "I imagine it has," Eleanor said. £11,000, Cecily said, with the particular tone of a woman who has been waiting to deploy a specific number. "Extraordinary. 12 in the end," Eleanor said. "The final accounting came in last week." Cecily's smile flickered. "And the tenant families?" she asked, and Eleanor could not tell whether the interest was genuine or performance. But she answered as if it were genuine because that was the only way she knew how to answer. "Arrangements have been corrected," Eleanor said. "The Marsh family, in particular, has been significantly affected by the situation. I hope to see the full restitution completed before the new year." "How admirable," Cecily said. There was a note in it that might have been sincere. "Might have been. You've been remarkably busy." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I have." Nathaniel reached her an hour into the evening. An hour was, Eleanor thought, about right long enough for him to have processed what he was seeing. Too long for him to have simply let it pass without speaking to her. He came through the crowd with the careful navigation of a man who does not want to appear to be doing exactly what he is doing. And he stopped beside her in a gap between two conversations where they had briefly a pocket of relative quiet. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathaniel." She did not turn to face him directly. She kept her attention distributed, the way she had learned to do at these events, so that the conversation did not become a spectacle. "Are you enjoying the evening?" I was invited," she said simply. "I didn't know you were coming. I didn't think I needed to consult you on my social calendar." A beat. "No," he said. "No, of course not." He was quiet for a moment. Around them the salon hummed and glittered. "You're wearing the Fairbourne colors." "I am. Half the room has noticed, I know." Another beat. Longer this time. Eleanor, his voice had dropped. She recognized the register. It was the voice he used when he wanted to speak honestly. The one that had almost no performance in it. "I owe you more than letters." "I know that. I have been trying to understand how badly I misread this." "All of it. You, the estate, what I valued." He stopped himself. "I don't say this expecting anything. I just need you to know that I understand now what I did not understand before." Eleanor turned and looked at him fully for the first time that evening. He looked tired still. He looked like a man who had been doing the uncomfortable interior work of honest self-examination, which was not a look she had ever seen on his face before, and which she found she could not dismiss as easily as she'd expected. "What did you not understand?" she asked. "That you were that everything you did, everything you built and managed and protected," he exhaled. "I thought competence was something I hired for. I didn't understand that it was something you were. That it was the same thing as your character, and your character was." He stopped. "I missed you," he said. "Not what I thought you were. You. What I've understood since you left is that I spent 6 years in the same house as something extraordinary and called it ordinary because I never paid enough attention to know the difference." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said carefully, "is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." Something moved in his face. "I know," he said. "That is rather the problem I've been living with." She turned back to the room. "There is a hearing in York in 3 weeks," she said. "You should attend. Not represented you. Specifically, the magistrate will want to see the estate's position stated directly." "I'll be there," he said without hesitation. "And the Marsh family. You visited them. Thomas Marsh's daughter. The girl who was taking in laundry." He was quiet for a moment. "Her name is Lily," he said. "She's 14 and she wants to be a teacher." A pause. "I've arranged for her to attend the school once it opens. I spoke to Edmund about the funding." Eleanor had not known that. She absorbed it in silence. "You spoke to Edmund," she said. "He was not particularly warm about it," Nathaniel said, with a rueful quality that might have been the beginning of humor. "He made it extremely clear that the arrangement was to benefit Miss Marsh, and was not to be counted in any way as a credit to me." "Edmund is precise," Eleanor said. "Edmund," Nathaniel said, "is terrifying. I have new respect for the fact that you've had him on your side your entire life." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. I should speak to Lady Pemberton," she said. "She's been waiting for a chance to get me alone for the last half hour, and I don't want to make her wait longer." "Of course." He took a half step back. And then, quietly, as she was turning away, "Eleanor, the sapphires are in the family vault. They'll remain there until I don't know until what. But they're there. Thank you," she said. And meant it as exactly that, a thank you, nothing more and nothing less. With no promise attached to it, she went to find Lady Pemberton. What happened next was the part that nobody who had been at the Ravenscroft ball 6 weeks earlier could have predicted, and the part that the London drawing rooms would be discussing for the remainder of the season. It started with Lord Hartley. Lord Hartley was 64 years old, held 3 parliamentary seats through family connections, and was one of the most influential men in the room, possibly in London. At that particular moment in the season, he had known the Fairbourne family for decades. He had not spoken to Eleanor in 3 years because Eleanor, as Nathaniel's quiet country Duchess, had not been a person it was particularly useful to speak to. He found her at 10:20 near the east wall of the main salon, in conversation with Lady Pemberton and 2 other women whose names Eleanor knew and whose opinion Eleanor had registered over the years as cautiously favorable. "Lady Fairbourne," Lord Hartley said. He did not say Lady Ravenscroft. He said it the same way Pemberton had said it, with the deliberate quality of a man making a precise choice. "I wonder if I might steal you for a moment." Lady made a gracious gesture of release. Eleanor turned to Hartley. He walked with her to a slightly quieter corner of the room, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who understood that other people would arrange themselves around him. "I've been reading about the Ravenscroft estate situation," he said, without preamble. "Have you?" Eleanor said. "I've also been reading about a certain school in the Fairbourne village," he said, "and a young teacher from York, and a rather dramatic hearing in front of the county magistrate." He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who spent his professional life assessing the weight of things. "You've been busy, Lady Fairbourne." "I've been doing what needed doing," she said. "Yes." He studied her. "I knew your grandfather. He was a man who understood that power wasn't about what you held, it was about what you built. What you left standing after you." He paused. "I see his character very clearly in what you've done these past weeks." Eleanor met his gaze. "The school will need additional support," she said. Because she recognized an opening when she saw one, and her grandmother had taught her never to leave one unused. "Miss Parrish is excellent, but the materials budget is constrained." If there were interested parties willing to contribute to a formal endowment, Hartley made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your grandfather," he said, "used to do the same thing. Have you at ease and then walk straight through the door you'd just opened." "I learned from his letters," she said. "And from Edmund Vallard." Hartley shook his head. "That man has been producing extraordinary women from ordinary circumstances for 40 years. He looked at her steadily. "Send me the proposal for the endowment. I'll see what I can do." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you, Lord Hartley." He inclined his head and moved away. And Eleanor stood with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has just accomplished something that will matter long after the evening is over. The moment that the room would remember, the moment that got written into every account of the Harwick gathering that season. The moment that transformed the story of the quiet Duchess and the ballroom humiliation into something else entirely came at 11:30. And it came in the form of Vivienne Ashford. Vivienne had arrived at the gathering an hour after Eleanor, which suggested she had not known Eleanor would be there, or had not known what Eleanor would look like when she arrived. She had spent the first hour working the room with the practiced ease of a woman who understood social survival, keeping her distance from Eleanor's orbit, maintaining the composure that was her primary instrument. But the room had shifted. Eleanor had felt it shifting all evening, the weight of attention redistributing. Slowly and undramatically, the way a tide moves rather than a wave. By 11 o'clock, Eleanor was the center of gravity in the salon. Not because of anything she had done dramatically, she had not made a speech, had not confronted anyone, had not performed anything. She had simply moved through the room being exactly who she was. And who she was had turned out to be more substantial than anyone, apparently, had previously understood. Vivienne's composure broke at 11:23. Eleanor knew the precise moment because she was speaking to Lord Hartley's wife when she felt the shift in the room's attention. And she turned in time to see Vivienne crossing toward her with a directness that had lost its earlier calculation and replaced it with something rawer. "Lady Fairbourne," Vivienne said. Her voice was controlled. But only just. Eleanor turned to face her fully. "Lady Ashford," she said. The people nearest them went very still, in the way that people go still when they understand they are about to witness something. Vivienne looked at the gold gown, at the Fairbourne crest, at Eleanor's face, composed, clear, entirely at ease in her own skin in a way that Vivienne, for all her beauty and practiced grace, could not quite replicate in this particular moment. "You've managed all of this very cleverly," Vivienne said. There was an edge in it, but underneath the edge was something that sounded less like anger and more like a woman who has just understood how badly she miscalculated something. "I haven't managed anything," Eleanor said. "I've simply done what needed doing." The room, Vivienne gestured slightly. "Taking in the salon. Paying attention?" Eleanor said. Vivienne's jaw tightened. "You want me to apologize," she said. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, and then she said something that nobody in the room expected. "No," she said. "I don't. What happened between you and my husband was between you and my husband. You did not make his choices for him." She held Vivienne's gaze. "What I want, Lady Ashford, is for you to understand something that I think you may have missed in all of this." Vivienne was very still. "I was never your competition," Eleanor said quietly. "I was never in a race you could win or lose. I am simply myself." And that has always been entirely sufficient. She paused. I hope you find something worth building. I genuinely do. Status borrowed from a man is a cold thing to live inside. Vivienne stared at her. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then Vivienne gave a short, stiff nod, turned, and walked away. Lady Heron appeared at Eleanor's shoulder approximately 4 seconds later, which strongly suggested she had been nearby the entire time. Well, Lady Heron said quietly. Don't, Eleanor said. I wasn't going to say a word. You were. I was going to say, Lady Heron said, with great dignity, that your grandmother would have said it almost exactly the same way. Eleanor breathed. Around her, the salon had resumed its roar of conversation and music and crystal. But something had settled, some invisible weight. Redistributed permanently, not to be retrieved. She found Edmund near the door at midnight, preparing to depart. Well, he said. Lord Hartley wants the endowment proposal, she said. Edmund raised an eyebrow. You asked him directly? He opened a door, she said. I walked through it. He studied her face for a moment, with the assessing attention he had been giving her since she was 4 years old. And Nathaniel? He asked. He spoke honestly. She considered how to say the next part. He is not the man I married, Edmund. He may be becoming someone better. I don't know yet whether that is something I want to be in proximity to. That, Edmund said, is a fair assessment. It's an honest one, she said. Which is all I know how to offer. He offered her his arm. Then let's go home, he said. She took it, and they went out through the Harwick doors into the cold London night. And behind them the salon continued its elaborate, glittering business. And Eleanor Fairbourne, the woman who had walked into that room as a forgotten wife and was walking out of it as herself, breathed the dark air and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Not victory, not triumph, something quieter and more permanent than either of those. The particular piece of a woman who has stopped apologizing for the size of who she is. The proposal for the school endowment was on Lord Hartley's desk within 4 days of the Harwick gathering. And his reply arrived within 6, which Edmund was the fastest he had ever seen Hartley move on anything that did not directly benefit Hartley personally, and which Edmund considered high praise. Eleanor read the letter at the Fairbourne library desk and set it down and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of quiet satisfaction before picking up the next item in the stack. There was always a next item. The York hearing for Garvey's formal trial was 10 days out. Aldrich had written 3 times in the past week with updates, each letter slightly more precisely worded than the last, which Eleanor had learned to read as his version of controlled excitement. Clara Jennings's testimony had been formally entered. The original receipts had been authenticated. The letters between Garvey and his brother-in-law had been reviewed by 2 independent solicitors and found to constitute evidence of deliberate conspiracy rather than mere negligence, which changed the nature of the charges significantly, and Aldrich believed the likely outcome considerably. She was reviewing his most recent letter when Mrs. Hadley appeared. Lady Heron, ma'am. Send her in. Lady Heron came through the door with the energy of a woman who has news and has been maintaining it under pressure for longer than was comfortable. The granary roof is finished, she said before she had fully sat down. Thomas Marsh's eldest did it in 3 days. The man works like he has something to prove. He does, Eleanor said. His family has been underpaid and overcharged for 4 years. He has a great deal to prove. Lady Heron accepted this with a nod. Miss Parrish arrives from York on Thursday, she continued. She wants to begin enrollment immediately. She says waiting until January is unnecessary if the building is ready. Then we won't wait until January, Eleanor said. There are 23 children confirmed, Lady Heron said. Lily Marsh is among them. Eleanor put the Aldrich letter down. 23, she said. Miss Parrish says she can manage 30 if needed. She is, Lady Heron added, with the tone of someone sharing a reassuring fact. An exceptionally organized woman. She arrived in her correspondence before she arrived in person. if you take my meaning." Eleanor did take her meaning. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what we need." Lady Heron studied her for a moment. "You look tired," she said. "I've been working. You said the same thing to Edmund on the carriage to London." It was true then as well. Lady Heron sat back. "Eleanor." Her voice had shifted, slightly lost the brisk reporting quality, and taken on something warmer and more direct. "When did you last do something that was not on a list?" Eleanor opened her mouth and then closed it. "That," Lady Heron said, "is what I thought. There is a great deal still requiring." "There is always a great deal requiring," Lady Heron said firmly. "There will be a great deal requiring in January and in March and in 2 years from now. That is the nature of having built something worth maintaining." She paused. "Take the afternoon. Walk the grounds. Read something that isn't legal correspondence. A beat. The work will be here when you return. It always is." Eleanor looked at her. "You sound like my mother," she said. "Your mother was a sensible woman," Lady Heron replied. Without apology, Eleanor took the afternoon. She walked the Fairbourne grounds for 2 hours, which was the first time in 6 weeks she had done anything that could reasonably be described as purposeless, and found to her mild surprise that purposelessness was considerably more restorative than she had remembered. She walked through the kitchen garden, where her mother had grown lavender. She walked along the stone wall that marked the eastern edge of the property and looked out across the valley where the Ravenscroft lands began. She sat for a while on the bench near the old oak that had been old when she was a child and was older now, which was a comfort in the way that very old things sometimes were. She thought about Nathaniel. She had been not thinking about Nathaniel with considerable discipline for 6 weeks, which was itself a form of thinking about him. She had organized everything she was doing: the estate accounts, the hearing, the school, the endowment, with the focused energy of a woman who has found better uses for her attention. But the discipline required effort, and effort meant he was never entirely absent from her mind. What she felt when she thought about him now was not the same thing she had felt standing in the Ravenscroft ballroom, watching him look at her like a stranger. That had been sharp, clarifying, final, the particular cut of a thing you realize you have been waiting to feel, because you already knew it was true. What she felt now was more complicated, more human. He had visited the Marsh family. He had arranged for Lily Marsh to attend the school. He had moved on the borrowing agreements and was working with Edmund's contact in London, and had attended the county magistrate's preliminary hearing in person, as she'd asked, and had stood in that room and answered every question put to him without deflection or excuse. She had heard about it from Aldrich, who had been present, and whose account was, by its nature, precise and without sentiment. His Grace had been forthright. His Grace had accepted responsibility for the failures of oversight without qualification. His Grace had made a statement regarding the tenant agreements that the magistrate had entered into the record as evidence of good faith. None of this was forgiveness. She knew that. She was not confusing one man's belated decency for a resolution of everything that had preceded it. But she was honest enough to notice that he was doing the work, not performing it, doing it. And that was a different thing. She sat on the bench under the old oak until the light began to change. And then she went back inside and ate supper, and did not pick up any correspondence until morning. The York hearing began on a Tuesday and lasted 2 days. Eleanor sat in the third row with Aldrich on her left and Edmund on her right, and she watched the case she had spent 6 weeks building get presented to the court in the measured, precise language of a legal proceeding, stripped of emotion and assembled into fact. And she felt the strange dual experience of recognizing something intimately and hearing it as if for the first time. Garvey sat at the defendant's table. He had aged, or perhaps she was simply seeing him differently. His solicitor was competent, but working with limited material, because the material was simply not there to support the alternative account he was attempting to construct. Clara Jennings testified on the second morning. Eleanor had not been certain how it would go. Clara was 22 years old and had never spoken in a formal legal proceeding. And the environment was not designed to be welcoming to young women with clerking experience and envelopes full of stolen receipts. But Clara had been organizing her courage for 14 months. And when she stood and answered the questions put to her, her voice was clear and her memory was exact, and she did not waver once. When Clara finished, Eleanor caught her eye across the room and nodded once. Clara exhaled and looked away, and Eleanor could see the relief in her whole body, the particular physical release of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally set it down. Garvey was convicted, not on the afternoon of the second day as Aldrich had predicted, but on the morning of the third, after the magistrate had reviewed the compiled documentation overnight and returned with a verdict that covered every charge filed, and several the prosecution been less certain about. Restitution was ordered. The northern parcel was formally returned to Ravenscroft estate management. Criminal sentencing was referred to the assizes. The tenant family's corrected agreements were entered into the permanent county record. Eleanor stood outside the courthouse afterward and breathed the cool York air and felt Aldrich appear at her shoulder. "Lady Fairbourne," he said, "Mr. Aldrich. 12,000. 416 pounds, he said. "The final accounting." "That's precise, I am," he said. A precise man. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it." He made a small contained gesture that she understood to mean, "This is what I am paid for, and also I found it genuinely satisfying, and neither of those things will be stated directly." "The restitution will take time to process," he said. "But the order is binding. The families will be made whole." She nodded. Behind her, she heard Edmund say something to someone. She didn't catch the words, but the tone was the satisfied one that he used when things had gone as they should. And then she heard another voice answer, and she recognized it. And she turned. Nathaniel was standing 10 feet away. He had told her he would attend. She had believed him. But seeing him here was still something. He looked like a man who had spent 2 days in a courtroom, watching the full account of his own negligence, presented in legal documentations, and had not looked away from any of it. Which was, she suspected, exactly what he had done. He met her eyes. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he crossed the distance between them and stopped. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. "Lily Marsh was in that room this morning," he said. "Did you know?" "She came with her father. She sat in the gallery and she watched the whole thing." A pause. She had a small notebook. She was writing things down. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. "What kind of things?" "I don't know. I couldn't see the pages." His voice was quiet. "But she was writing." He looked at Eleanor. "You did that." "She did that herself," Eleanor said. "I simply removed what was in her way." Nathaniel was quiet. "I've been doing a great deal of thinking," he said, "about what removing things from people's way would have looked like if I had done it years ago. What I might have seen if I had been paying the right kind of attention. This was the most dangerous territory of any of it, more dangerous than the hearing. More dangerous than the London salon. Because this was where the conversation could tip into something that required an answer she was not yet certain she had." "Nathaniel," she said carefully. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. Quickly, clearly, as if he understood the danger as well as she did. "I want to be precise about that. I am not standing here asking for forgiveness or return, or I understand that those are things you would need to arrive at yourself. If you arrived at them at all. I'm not asking." He held her gaze. "I'm just telling you that I see it. All of it, you. Clearly, finally, and I wanted you to know that." She looked at him. The man in front of her was not the man she had married. The man she had married had been charming and confident, and thoroughly certain that his understanding of the world was the complete and correct version of it. The man in front of her was something less polished and more real, a man who had been taken apart by the consequences of his own choices and was attempting, piece by piece, to understand what to build in place of what he'd broken. "I know," she said. He nodded once. They stood for a moment in the kind of silence that isn't empty. "The school opens next week," she said. "I know Edmund told me." A pause. "May I attend the opening?" Not to nod as anything formal. "I would simply like to be there." She considered him. "Yes," she said. "You may." Something moved in his face that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was somewhere in the territory between them. Edmund appeared at Eleanor's shoulder with the timing of a man who had been monitoring the situation from precisely the right distance. "Carriage is ready," he said. He looked at Nathaniel with the expression he reserved for situations he had decided to observe without comment. "Ravenscroft, Valehart," Nathaniel said. It was not unfriendly. Edmund's expression shifted by approximately 1 degree. "You did the right thing," Edmund said. "Coming here. Staying." He said it without inflection, as simple fact. It was the right thing to do. Nathaniel looked briefly surprised, which suggested he had not expected anything from Edmund that qualified as acknowledgement. "I should have done a great deal more right things," he said. "A great deal sooner. You should have." He offered Eleanor his arm. "Shall we?" She took it, and as they turned toward the carriage, she glanced back once at Nathaniel still standing where she'd left him, watching her go with the expression of a man who has stopped expecting the things he used to expect and has not yet decided what to want in their place. She turned back and walked on. The school opened on a Friday. 26 children arrived, 3 more than Lady Heron had confirmed, which Miss Parish absorbed without visible distress, and which Eleanor took as excellent evidence that they had chosen the right teacher. The granary had been transformed into something clean and well lit and smelling of new timber and chalk, with 2 long tables and benches that Thomas Marsh's eldest had built himself over the course of a week with the particular focused energy of a man doing something that mattered. Eleanor stood at the back and watched the children come in. She watched Lily Marsh find her seat at the far table, open a small notebook, the same small notebook, Eleanor realized, that Nathaniel had seen at the courthouse, and look around at the room with an expression that was part apprehension and part something that had no name except perhaps the word future. Seen clearly for the first time, Nathaniel stood 3 feet to Eleanor's right. He had arrived early, without fanfare, and positioned himself at the back as she had. And he had said almost nothing since, which was the right choice. Miss Parish called the room to attention. She was 30 years old and small, and had the particular quiet authority of a person who has never needed volume to be heard. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 26 children looking back at her and said, without preamble, "Good morning. My name is Miss Parish. This is your school. Let's begin." Eleanor felt something move through her, not a dramatic feeling. Nothing she would have been able to describe precisely to anyone afterward. Just the particular satisfaction of a thing completed. A thing that would continue after her, that would stand and function and matter without requiring her constant attention, because it had been built correctly from the beginning. Lady Heron appeared silently at her left. The 3 of them stood at the back and watched Miss Parish begin. After a few minutes, Lady Heron said very quietly, "Your mother would have wept." "My mother never wept at anything," Eleanor said. She would have made an exception for this. Eleanor said nothing. But she did not disagree. The twist came 3 days after the school opened, in the form of a letter that arrived at Fairbourne Hall on a Monday morning without Aldrich's name on the outside and with a London postmark that she didn't immediately recognize. She opened it at the desk. It was from a solicitor she had never engaged, a firm in London called Whitmore and Crane, whose name she knew by reputation as one of the city's more prestigious practices. The letter was addressed to her by her full name, Eleanor Margaret Fairbourne, which was her name before her marriage, and which only the Fairbourne family record and a handful of people who had known her since childhood would have used. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it a 3rd time. The letter informed her that the Fairbourne family estate, including all associated lands, properties, and financial instruments, was subject to a disputed inheritance claim that had been filed 3 months ago by a man named Arthur Calloway, who identified himself as the illegitimate son of her father's late brother. The claim asserted that Eleanor's inheritance was invalid on the grounds that her father had died without male heirs and that the family charter, in its original 1742 form, contained language requiring the estate to pass through the male line in the event of such a situation. The claim also asserted that Eleanor's marriage to the Duke of Ravenscroft had effectively transferred her claim to her husband, and that Nathaniel, by his own separation from Eleanor, had therefore relinquished any rights the Fairbourne estate might have sought to preserve through that marriage. Arthur Calloway was claiming Fairbourne Hall. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk. She looked at the wall. She picked up her pen. Mrs. Hadley appeared. "Send for Edmund," Eleanor said. "Today urgent." Mrs. Hadley took one look at her face and did not ask any questions. Edmund arrived by early evening and read the letter in 4 minutes of absolute silence. Then he set it down and took his spectacles off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Arthur Calloway," he said. "You know the name," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "I knew his father," Edmund said. "Your uncle's arrangement was not a secret among the family's legal counsel. The boy was born in 1791. Your father chose not to acknowledge him, which was his legal right at the time and remains legally binding." He paused. However, Eleanor said, "the 1742 charter." He set his spectacles back on. "I have read that document 3 times over the course of my career, for various purposes. The language regarding male succession in the event of is ambiguous," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You've read it," he said. "My grandmother had a copy in her correspondence," Eleanor said. "I found it when I opened the hall. I've read it 4 times. "Of course you have," he said. Not unkindly. "The language is ambiguous, yes. In the literal reading of the 1742 text, there is a case to be made. It is not a strong case, but it is a case." He picked up the letter again. "Whitmore and Crane are not theatrical. They would not file this without believing they had something. They have the charter language," Eleanor said. "And they have the argument about my marriage." "The marriage argument is weaker," Edmund said. "Your grandmother's trust was structured specifically to prevent marital transfer of Fairbourne assets. That was done deliberately, in 1802, with the very clear intention of protecting you." He paused. "Your grandmother understood something about the nature of marriage in this society that she apparently wished to guard against." "She was a practical woman," Eleanor said. "She was a remarkable woman," Edmund said, "and she built her protections very carefully." He set the letter down again. "But the charter, that is the real question." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I know someone," she said. Edmund raised an eyebrow. "Lord Hartley," she said. "He mentioned at the Harwick gathering that he had served on the parliamentary committee that reviewed estate charter legislation in 1809. The revised interpretation guidelines from that committee would potentially supersede the 1742 language." Edmund finished. He stared at her. "Eleanor, I did my reading," she said. He made the sound in the back of his throat that she had now definitively categorized as respect. "You did not know about this claim when you were at the Harwick gathering," he said. "No. But you built the relationship with Hartley anyway." "I built it because it was worth building," she said. "And because the endowment needed support. The fact that it may also be useful in this context is remarkably fortunate," Edmund said. "Or remarkably thorough," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Write to Hartley tonight," he said. "I will contact Aldrich in the morning. We will need a counterfiling within 10 days to establish your response to the claim before it acquires any additional momentum." He stood. "And Eleanor," she looked up. "This is not over quickly," he said. "This is not Garvey, where the evidence was clear and the outcome followed logically. This is a charter dispute, which means it is a legal argument. Which means it will take time and will not be comfortable." He held her gaze. "Are you prepared for that?" She thought about Fairbourne Hall. About her mother's desk and her grandmother's letter, and the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the old oak in the grounds, and the kitchen garden where the lavender grew. She thought about 26 children sitting at long tables in the old granary, learning to read in a school that had her grandmother's name on the endowment charter. She thought about what it meant to have built something worth defending. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared." Edmund nodded. "Then let's get to work." She wrote to Hartley that night. She wrote to Aldrich. She wrote a fourth letter, the most difficult one. Because it required her to cross a boundary she had been keeping carefully maintained to Nathaniel. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with the phrasing. What she told him was straightforward. There was a claim against the Fairbourne estate. The marriage argument was one of the claim's weaker elements. But it was present, and it would be better for both of them if his position was formally and clearly stated before the claim progressed further. She was not asking him to take her side. She was asking him to state clearly and legally the truth of the situation as it pertained to the marital transfer question. She did not frame it as a request for help, because it wasn't. She signed it Eleanor Fairbourne, without any other title. She gave it to the night rider at midnight. Then she went to bed and slept 4 hours, and was at her desk before dawn. Because there was work to do, and she was at the bottom of everything. A woman who did the work in front of her without waiting for the fear to pass first. The fear would pass or it would not. Either way, Fairbourne Hall was hers. And she was not done fighting for it. Nathaniel's reply arrived the next morning before Eleanor had finished her first cup of tea. She had not expected him to respond until evening at the earliest London correspondence, rarely moved faster than a full day, even with an urgent writer, which meant he had either been awake when her letter arrived or had read it and written back before he slept. And either way, the speed of it told her something she was not quite ready to name. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that he had already been contacted by Whitmore and Crane, a courtesy notification. Apparently, since the marriage argument required his formal position to be on record. He had, without waiting for her letter, instructed his own solicitors to have a statement declaring that no transfer of Fairbourne assets had occurred through the marriage, that the Fairbourne trust instruments were independent and had remained so throughout, and that he would testify to this effect in any proceeding that required it. The second paragraph said that Arthur Callaway had approached him directly 6 weeks ago and had attempted to propose an arrangement by which Nathaniel would support the inheritance claim in exchange for a financial settlement from the Callaway interests. Nathaniel had refused. He had not mentioned it to Eleanor at the time because he had not considered it a credible threat and had not wanted to introduce further disruption into a situation that was already complicated. He understood now that this had been the wrong decision and was telling her because she deserved the full picture. The third paragraph said, "I am sorry for the Callaway approach and my silence about it. Yes, but also for everything that preceded it. I have been writing and not sending various versions of that sentence for 2 months. I am sending it now because I have run out of reasons not to." Eleanor read the letter twice. She folded it and put it in the desk drawer with the others. Then she called for Edmund. The Callaway development changed the legal picture in ways that Aldrich spent an entire morning explaining. With the focused precision of a man who has found something genuinely alarming and is determined to convey it accurately without being alarmist. The short version, as Eleanor understood it, Arthur Callaway was not simply a man with a disputed inheritance claim. He was a man who had been building this case methodically for 3 years. He had legal backing from a firm with resources. He had the 1742 charter language. And he had, until Nathaniel's refusal, been attempting to construct a coalition of interested parties who would benefit from a Fairbourne estate under different management. Who else did he approach? Eleanor asked. Aldrich hesitated. Mr. Aldrich, she said. Lord Pemberton's younger son, Aldrich said. He holds debt instruments connected to 2 Fairbourne tenant properties from 15 years ago, legacies from your father's time that were never fully resolved. Calloway approached him with the suggestion that a favorable outcome to the inheritance claim might include a settlement of those instruments. Eleanor was very still. Did Pemberton's son agree? He declined, Aldrich said. And he informed Lord Pemberton, who informed Edmund, who is why I know about it. Lord Pemberton's son, as it happens, is 30 years old and considerably more principled than Calloway apparently anticipated. And who else? Another hesitation. A member of the county land board, Aldrich said. A man named Foster, who has jurisdiction over the charter interpretation process at the local level. Calloway's firm filed the formal claim with Foster's office. Eleanor absorbed that. Is Foster the right man for this claim to land with? She asked. Aldrich looked at his papers. He is not, he said carefully. A man known for independent thinking, meaning Calloway chose him deliberately. That would be my assessment. She looked at Edmund. Edmund's expression had the quality it got when he had already thought 3 steps further than the present conversation and was waiting for the conversation to catch up. Hartley, Eleanor said. Hartley, Edmund confirmed. The Parliamentary Committee Review. The 1,809 Interpretation Guidelines. If those guidelines are formally invoked, does Foster's jurisdictional authority hold? It becomes significantly complicated, Aldrich said. Complicated enough that the claim would almost certainly be referred to a higher body for interpretation. He paused. At which level the evidence in your favor is considerably stronger. Then we need Hartley to invoke the guidelines formally, Eleanor said. As a parliamentary matter, not just an advisory one, Edmund made the sound. Can he do that? Lady Heron asked. From the corner she had arrived midway through the meeting with the air of someone who had not been invited, but considered herself necessary. Which Eleanor had stopped arguing with weeks ago. He can initiate the process, Edmund said. Whether the full committee agrees to review is another question. He'll agree, Eleanor said. Edmund raised an eyebrow. The endowment, Eleanor said. He is now formally connected to the Fairbourne School Endowment. His name is on the charter document. If the Fairbourne estate is transferred away from Fairbourne management, that endowment is immediately at risk. She held Edmund's gaze. Lord Hartley does not involve his name in things he is not prepared to protect. Edmund sat back. You knew this, he said. It was not quite an accusation. I knew that building relationships worth keeping was better than building nothing, she said. I didn't know I would need Hartley for this specific purpose. But I knew that a man like him, connected to something he values, is a different kind of ally than a man you simply ask for a favor. Lady Heron, from the corner, said quietly, Your grandmother. My grandmother, Eleanor agreed. She wrote to Hartley that afternoon. She wrote the letter with the same directness she had used at the Harwick gathering, no performance. No decoration, just the facts laid out cleanly and the request stated plainly. His reply came in 2 days. He would invoke the parliamentary review process. He had already spoken to 2 other committee members who agreed the jurisdictional question warranted formal attention. The review would be filed within the week. Eleanor read the letter at her desk and set it down and did not allow herself more than 5 seconds of relief before picking up the next piece of work. Because relief was for after, and they were not yet after. But the 5 seconds felt good. The formal hearing on the Calloway claim was scheduled for a Thursday in December, 3 weeks after the parliamentary review was filed. It was not the usual venue for these matters. The involvement of the parliamentary guidelines had pushed it from Foster County office to the Circuit Court in York, which was precisely what they had needed and which Calloway's solicitors had apparently not anticipated. Aldrich was magnificent. Eleanor had known he was good. She had not fully understood until she watched him work in an adversarial proceeding against Whitmore and Crane, a firm with more resources and considerably more arrogance, exactly how good he was. He dismantled the 1742 charter argument with the methodical patience of a man laying out a case he has prepared for weeks. Citing the 1809 parliamentary guidelines 3 separate times in language so specific and so precise that Whitmore and Crane's lead solicitor could not find a clean rebuttal and spent 20 minutes circling around the edges of one instead. Eleanor sat in the second row. Edmund was to her left. Lady Heron was to her right. Nathaniel sat 4 rows back, which she had known before she turned to check because she had felt him come in. She did not turn to check for another hour. When she did, briefly he met her eyes and gave the smallest possible nod. Not encouragement exactly, more like "I am here and I am not going anywhere." She turned back to the proceedings. The Callaway argument rested on 3 legs. The 1742 charter language, the marriage transfer assertion, and a claim that Eleanor's grandmother's 1802 trust restructuring had been improperly executed and was therefore void. The third leg was the one Eleanor had not seen coming. And when Whitmore and Crane introduced it, she felt the particular cold clarity of a woman who has been surprised by something she should have anticipated and is recalibrating in real time. She leaned to Edmund. "The 1802 trust," she said quietly. "I heard," he said. He did not look alarmed, which was itself alarming. Because Edmund's absence of alarm could mean either that he had already addressed the issue or that he was performing calm to prevent her from panicking. She had known him long enough to know it was probably the former. "Did you know they had this?" "I suspected they might attempt something in this direction," he said. "I asked Aldrich to prepare accordingly." A pause. 3 weeks ago. She stared at him. "You didn't tell me you had sufficient to manage," he said. "I handled it." She pressed her lips together and looked back at the proceedings. Aldrich, when the trust challenge was formally introduced, responded with a document that he produced from his case with the unhurried confidence of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. It was the original 1802 trust execution, notarized by 3 witnesses whose credentials were impeccable, accompanied by a legal opinion from a King's Counsel obtained, Eleanor would later learn, by Edmund at considerable personal expense, and without saying a word to her about it, confirming the trust's validity under every applicable interpretation of the law. Whitmore and Crane's lead solicitor looked at the document and said nothing for 12 seconds. Eleanor counted. Then he asked for a recess. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When proceedings resumed, the Callaway claim had been reduced, effectively, to the 1742 charter language alone. The marriage transfer argument had been formally withdrawn in light of Nathaniel's statement, and the trust challenge had been abandoned in the face of the King's Counsel opinion. The 1742 charter language, stripped of its supporting arguments, met the 1809 parliamentary guidelines and lost. The claim was denied. The room did not erupt. Legal proceedings didn't erupt, they concluded, with the particular anticlimactic precision of official language. And then people gathered their papers and put on their coats, and the machinery moved on to the next matter on its docket. Eleanor sat in the second row and heard the words and did not immediately stand. Lady Heron put her hand over Eleanor's. Eleanor looked at it. Lady Heron's hand was warm and solid and entirely real. And Eleanor was grateful for it in a way she did not have language for. "It's done," Lady Heron said. "It's done," Eleanor said. She stood. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Arthur Callaway passed within 10 feet of her. He was a man of about 40, with a face that might have been sympathetic in a different life, carrying the diminished posture of someone who has just watched something they built carefully come apart. He looked at her as he passed, not with hostility, Not with regret exactly, but with the expression of a man who has finally seen something clearly that he'd been misreading for a long time. She held his gaze. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the court had not already said more cleanly and completely than she could have managed. He looked away first and walked on, and his solicitor followed. And that was the end of Arthur Calloway. Nathaniel found her in the corridor 5 minutes later. After Edmund and Aldrich had moved ahead, and Lady Heron had tactfully gone to find her coat and give them the space that she had apparently decided they needed. He stopped 2 feet away. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you for your statement," she said, "and for telling me about Calloway's approach. Even delayed. I should have told you immediately." "Yes," she said. "You should have. But you told me, and you refused him. Those are the things that mattered in the end." He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was moving around them, other people collecting coats and exchanging words, but they were in that particular pocket of stillness that two people sometimes find in the middle of ordinary movement. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "And I want to be clear, before I ask it, that the answer no is a complete answer that I will accept without any further. I will accept it entirely. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. He took a breath. "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. This is not a request for a return to what was before. That is not what I'm asking for, and I know it is not something you would consider, and I'm not asking for it." He held her gaze. "I am asking for dinner. One evening. A chance to sit across from you rather than the person I actually am was when I wasted 6 years not paying the right kind of attention." He paused. "Because I would very much like to know you, the you that exists now. The you that has been here the entire time that I was looking in the wrong direction." The corridor continued to move around them. Eleanor thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about everything. She thought about 6 years in a ballroom and a pair of gloves set on a table. She thought about a bench under an old oak and letters in a desk drawer and a 14-year-old girl with a notebook sitting in a gallery watching justice be done. She thought about who she had been when this story started and who she was standing in this corridor right now. And she understood, clearly and without drama, that those were 2 different women, not because she had changed what she was, but because she had finally stopped translating herself for other people and started simply being it. She thought about Nathaniel's face at the Harwick salon, seeing her clearly for the first time. She thought about his letter arriving before dawn. She thought about a man sitting 4 rows back in a courtroom, not going anywhere. She thought about what it meant to choose something from a position of strength rather than a position of need. "Yes," she said. Something in his face did a complicated and entirely genuine thing that she thought he probably would have controlled if he'd had time to prepare for it. "Yes," he said. "Dinner," she said, "one evening, as the people we actually are." She held his gaze. "I am not the woman you married, Nathaniel. I want to be clear about that. She is gone. The woman in front of you has a school with 26 children in it, and a legal endowment and a correspondence with Lord Hartley, and a solicitor she trusts with her life, and an oak tree in her garden that she has made a habit of sitting under when things get difficult." She paused. "If you would like to have dinner with that woman, I am available." "That woman," he said, quietly and with complete sincerity, "is the most yes. I would very much like to have dinner with that woman." She almost smiled. "Thursday," she said. 7 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded once and went to find Lady Heron. Edmund was waiting by the carriage. He looked at her face when she came out and read it with the efficiency of a man who has known her for 30 years. "Thursday dinner," he said. She stopped. "How do you?" "I have known you since you were 4 years old," he said. "And I have known him since he was 22, and I have been watching the 2 of you for 20 minutes. And I am not," he said, with great dignity, "an unobservant man." She looked at him. "Are you going to tell me it's too soon?" she said. "No," he said. I am going to tell you that your grandmother waited 11 years after your grandfather's death before she allowed herself to be happy again. And that she told me in her last year that it was the single decision she most regretted. He opened the carriage door. I am not going to tell you what to do. I am going to tell you that life is shorter than the caution we apply to it. He paused. And that you deserve someone who sees you clearly. He has a great deal of work to do, she said. He does, Edmund agreed. So do most people worth knowing. He gestured toward the carriage. After you. The Thursday dinner was quiet. Not uncomfortably quiet, the kind of quiet that happens between two people who have decided to stop performing and are still learning what's left when the performance drops. They ate at the long table in the Fairbourne dining room, with the candles that Mrs. Hadley had arranged without being asked, and then made herself scarce with the discretion of a woman who understood the moment precisely. They talked about the school, about Lily Marsh and Miss Parrish, and the fact that enrollment had already grown to 31, and Miss Parrish had written Eleanor a letter suggesting they might need a second teacher by spring, which Eleanor was already looking into. They talked about the estate, about the corrected tenant agreements and the restitution timeline, and the borrowing renegotiation that Edmund's contact had finalized at considerably better terms than anyone had initially expected. They talked about his mother, who had written him a letter after the Harwick gathering that he described as precise and uncomfortable, and which Eleanor gathered meant that the Dowager Duchess had opinions about how her son had conducted himself and was not shy about expressing them. She liked you, Nathaniel said. She told me once, in the second year of our marriage, that you were the most competent person she had encountered in 30 years of watching the aristocracy manage its affairs. She never said that to me, Eleanor said. She said it to me in a tone that suggested I should understand the implication, he said. I did not understand the implication. No, Eleanor said. You didn't. I understand it now. She looked at him across the table. What changed, she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. Not the events. What changed inside you? He was quiet for a moment. He turned his wineglass in his hand. I walked into the Marsh farm, he said finally. And Thomas Marsh shook my hand. He did not have to shake my hand. He had every reason to refuse me. But he stood in the doorway of his house, and he looked at me and he said, I reckon a man who can see what he did wrong and face it is worth a second consideration. He set the glass down. A tenant farmer, whose family had been overcharged for 4 years under my management. And he shook my hand and gave me a second consideration. He looked at her. I did not feel entitled to that, but it made me understand something about what consideration actually costs the person who offers it. Eleanor was quiet. He's a good man, she said. He is a remarkable man, Nathaniel said. His daughter is going to be extraordinary. She already is. They sat with that for a moment. The candles burned between them, steady and unhurried. And Eleanor thought about what it meant to sit at this table, her grandmother's table, her mother's table, her table across from a man who was doing the slow and uncomfortable work of becoming someone better. Not finished, not forgiven entirely, not yet, not in the full and permanent way that would take time she had not yet given. But present, honest, paying attention. It was not nothing. It was, she thought, the beginning of something she had not expected to want and had found herself wanting anyway. 3 months later, the Fairbourne school enrolled its 38th student. Miss Parrish hired a second teacher, a young woman from Leeds named Miss Hartwell, who had trained under a Quaker educator and had opinions about mathematics that Miss Parrish described as radical and Eleanor found entirely sensible. The restitution to the tenant families was completed in full in February. Thomas Marsh paid off the corrected arrears and came to Fairbourne Hall to inform Eleanor in person, with his hat in his hands and his wife beside him. And Eleanor made them both sit down and have tea, and told them the debt had been Garvey's creation and not theirs, and that she hoped they would stop carrying it now. Margaret Marsh cried. She apologized for crying. Eleanor handed her a handkerchief and told her there was nothing to apologize for. Lily Marsh, by spring, was helping Miss Parrish with the younger children's reading lessons on Tuesday afternoons. She was still carrying her notebook. The endowment, with Lord Hartley's formal backing, was established as a permanent institution, the Fairbourne Educational Trust, with a charter that named Eleanor as founding trustee and specified that the school would remain in operation regardless of any changes in property ownership or family circumstance. In perpetuity. Edmund reviewed the charter and said it was the most watertight document he had seen in 40 years of legal work. Eleanor said she'd had a good teacher. Edmund made the sound that was respect. On the first morning of April, Eleanor stood in the grounds of Fairbourne Hall, near the old oak, in the early light that came clean and new over the valley. The kitchen garden was beginning to show its first green. The school, her grandmother's name on the endowment charter. 38 children inside it. 2 teachers who knew what they were doing sat at the far end of the village. Solid and real and permanent. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. Nathaniel. He had been coming to Fairbourne Hall on Thursdays for 3 months, and sometimes on other days when the business of these estates required coordination. And the line between the professional and the personal had been blurring gradually, and without announcement. The way lines did when 2 people stopped, pretending they weren't paying attention to each other. He stopped beside her and looked out at the valley. They stood in silence for a moment. "The Marsh farm looks better," he said. "I rode past it this morning. Thomas replanted the eastern field," she said. "He told me last week he expects the best yield in 8 years. Good pause. Edmund tells me the endowment charter is fully executed. It is. He also tells me," Nathaniel said, with a quality in his voice that she had come to recognize as him approaching something he'd been working up to, "that you've been approached about expanding the model. A similar school in the next county. Lady Whitford asked me about it," she said. "She has a property that would suit. The funding question is manageable if the structure follows the same model." "I know," he said. "I told Edmund I'd contribute to the second endowment, if you'd accept it." She looked at him. "That's not a small commitment," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She studied his face. He met her gaze without deflection, had been meeting it without deflection for 3 months, which she had been noticing and had not commented on, because some things needed to accumulate silently before they could be spoken. "Why?" she said. "Because it matters," he said. "Because you built something that matters, and I would like to be part of building more of it." He paused. "And because I find that I am deeply in love with you, Eleanor. Not with who I thought you were or who I wanted you to be, or some comfortable version of you that fits easily into the life I used to think I wanted." He looked at her with the precise steadiness of a man who has rehearsed nothing and is simply telling the truth. "With you. The woman who fires estate stewards before breakfast and writes to parliamentary lords about endowment charters and sits under oak trees when she needs to think and has made 38 children's lives materially better in 4 months and cannot, for the life of her, pass a problem without solving it." The valley was quiet around them. The morning light was coming fully over the ridge now. Golden real. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She thought about a ballroom and a pair of gloves and a woman who had walked out into the cold and not stopped walking. She thought about everything she had built since then, not to prove something, not out of anger, but because building was what she did when no one was telling her what she was worth. She thought about what it meant to stand on her own ground, in her own name, choosing her own life with both hands. She thought about what it meant to choose someone not from loneliness, not from obligation, not from the comfortable habit of a life already arranged, but from a position of such complete self-possession that the choice was entirely, finally, her own. "I know," she said. He blinked. "I know you love me," she said. "I've known for some weeks. I was waiting to see if you'd say it, or keep carrying it around looking uncomfortable." Something moved through his expression that was half surprise and entirely genuine. "You," he said, "are remarkable." "I know that too," she said. And for the first time in all of it, in 6 months, of courtrooms and letters and carriages and late evenings at her grandmother's desk, she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and uncomplicated. And it rose out into the April morning and dissolved into the valley air. He laughed too, quietly, like a man who has not had much practice with uncomplicated things and is finding that he has missed them. She looked at him, still smiling, and said, "I am not rushing anything." "I want to be clear about that. Absolutely clear," he said. "I have a school to expand, and an endowment to charter and a correspondence with Lord Hartley that requires attention at least twice a week. I would expect nothing less, and I will always be Eleanor Fairbourne," she said. "That name is mine. Whatever else changes, that does not." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen at the Harwick salon, the one that meant he was finally seeing clearly, and said, with complete and simple sincerity, "I would not have it any other way." She looked out at the valley. At the Fairbourne lands, green and real beneath the April light. At the school in the village. At everything she had built from the rubble of a single night when she had set down her gloves and walked away from everything that wasn't hers and toward everything that was. She reached out and took his hand, not because she needed to, not because she had been waiting to, but because she wanted to. Freely and completely, from a position of such settled strength that the gesture cost her nothing and meant everything. Eleanor Fairbourne had walked out of a ballroom with nothing but her own name, and she had built a life worthy of it, and now she stood on her own ground. In her own light, not rescue, not return. Not the old life repaired and offered back, something new. Something she had made herself, something that was finally and completely hers.